Hello everybody and welcome to the training on supporting people with loss and grief. My name is Dr. Ailish Mooney. I'm a clinical psychologist in Shearystown House, and this presentation was also co-written with the help of Eilish Rojak, speech and language therapist in Shearystown House. So just to start by saying today's presentation is a bit heavy. Obviously it's about loss, grief, bereavement. So just kind of make sure that you are looking after yourself during it, that you're checking in with yourself. Grief is a universal human experience. We've all had losses or bereavement at some point in our life, so it can bring up some heavy emotions and feelings for us. So maybe just put something nice in for yourself after the presentation's over, and give yourself time to go through it if you need it. So we're going to get cracking with the grief outline. So grief is a normal human emotion or set of emotions that occurs in response to a significant loss. It's a universal experience. It applies to all human beings regardless of their abilities or disabilities. Grief is our emotional response to loss. It can emerge as a result of a death or a multitude of everyday experience related to loss. And these losses can be actual or perceived. So actual losses can include the death of a loved one or the loss of a significant relationship in your life, the loss of your home, the loss of a belonging, maybe a car that was crashed. They're actual losses. Perceived losses include something that was hoped for or planned for that was never realised. That comes up quite a lot for people with intellectual disabilities and physical disabilities. So something was hoped for, planned for, but that for some reason was never realised. So one of those things that comes up quite regularly in intellectual disability services is the hope and dream of having a family, getting married, having children, living in your own home. And for so many people we support, that dream is never realised for whatever reason, whatever barrier is in place. And that loss and that grief associated with that is very real. So, grief being a universal emotion, it's important to remember that while grief is a universal emotion and everyone experiences it at some point in their life, it is a very unique and individual experience for each and every person. So while there are some shared characteristics of grief and bereavement that are common to most people, each person will experience grief differently. They will have their own grief journey, their own bereavement journey, and it will be individual to them. The life experiences a person has, the characteristics sometimes associated with having an intellectual disability can often have an impact on how a person grieves and how other people interpret their grief responses. So today's training is going to cover what normal grief is, some of the concepts of death and models of grief, and then it's going to primarily focus on the practical supports. So how to prepare for a loss, what helps after bereavement, how to support somebody's understanding, how to support expressions of grief, and what can you say and do. So why do we explore bereavement? So all people experience loss and grief. People with intellectual disabilities experience more losses than the typical population. So if you imagine your life, you might have, let's say you have lots of really important relationships. So you might have parents, you might have siblings, you might have 4 or 5 friends, you might have a husband, you might have children, you might have grandparents, you might have aunts, uncles, cousins, colleagues that you work with. So you might have, let's say, 100 people that are close to you at different levels, but close to you in your life. For many people with intellectual disabilities, their circle of friends or circle of important people in their life is much smaller. So, for someone with an intellectual disability, they might have their family, they might have a couple of staff they're close to, they might have a couple of friends they're close to. If they have a job, they might have some colleagues, but usually those circles are much smaller. So when we lose somebody in our lives, obviously that's very painful, that's really difficult. But we don't, let's say you lose one person, you lose one of the 100 people that are close to you. And while that is extremely difficult for us, it's not everything. For someone with an intellectual disability, if they had maybe 10 people who were close to them and they lose one, that's 1/10 of their whole world. So the losses can be really, really significant, but also people with intellectual disabilities tend to have more losses. So if you take, for example, that losses aren't always deaths, they're often, someone who's left your life, the ending of a relationship. For many of the people we support, they have staff who leave all of the time. So they leave to get other jobs, they leave to retire, they leave because they've just moved to a different house or a different day centre or a different area. In addition, then, lots of their colleagues, lots of the people who are their friends who also have disabilities might move to different areas, they might move houses, different locations, they may not get the same opportunities to see each other, or they might die. So many people with intellectual disabilities experiences more loss than the typical population. It's important to mention that all people have the right to know about the death of a loved one. Immediate and ongoing support is crucial. People with intellectual disabilities are often excluded from funerals or the grief process, with the understanding that maybe people with intellectual disabilities don't understand what's going on, or they might find it too hard, or it might be too upsetting for them. So instead of allowing them to be part of it and to process grief in their own way, it's often a response to try and shield people from grief. And I suppose we know from our experience of talking to people with disabilities and the research in the area that this can often make things worse. And I suppose the other thing is staff and family members sometimes feel very unsure about how to support people. And they're not sure what to say. People don't want to make it worse, so they tend to say nothing instead of just kind of remembering that actually for most people it's just being there. It's just being there to support them that it's important. You're very unlikely going to say something that's going to make it worse. The experience is the experience. But we will talk about some things that might make things a little bit easier in terms of coming up with ideas. So take a second to have a look at this picture. Think about what you see, what emotions it brings up for you. So I see contentment, I see joy, I see love, I see belonging. Now take a second to have a look at this picture. So what kind of feelings or emotions does this bring up? For me, I see loss, longing, sadness, grief. It's very evident from just two pictures. One is full of life and colour, the other is kind of beige and sad. In a nutshell, that's grief. So, just to some technical terms, what is grief? Grief is made up of 4 dimensions relating to a loss. So your feelings, your thoughts, your behaviours, and the physical sensations relating to loss. So when we're talking about feelings associated with grief, it varies depending on your religion, culture, closeness to the person who died, your personality. There's lots of things that can impact. And this list is by no means exhaustive, but some common feelings that can emerge as a result of loss or grief are obviously upset, sadness, loneliness, anger, denial. Relief, sometimes if the person was, suffering or sick for a long time. Shock and disbelief are fairly common. Abandonment, feelings of abandonment and loss. Numbness, helplessness, fatigue, guilt, yearning, anxiety, resentment, for your resentment towards yourself, your family, or your faith. And then fight, flight, freeze responses are often quite common. So when something, in particular when something sudden happens, they're fairly common. So when we're looking at thoughts associated with grief, we're looking at changes in a person's thinking process. And that might include difficulties in attending or difficulties in concentrating. And when we talk about attending there, we talk about kind of paying attention. Difficulties making decision. So something as simple as what do you want to eat might be difficult when somebody's in the depths of grief. Somebody might be concerned and confused. There might be thoughts about about thinking about themselves and others. They might be preoccupied with the person who has died, so that person is taking up all of their thoughts. Or they might have very particular thoughts or specific thoughts that might include things like, it can't be true, why me, it was all my fault that they died. I'm always going to feel like this. I will never get over this. And I feel scared and lonely. They're fairly common thoughts after somebody has died. So next we're looking at behaviours. So grief and loss can be associated with changes in somebody's behaviour. And I suppose when we're talking about people with intellectual disabilities, many of them have difficulty communicating their thoughts and feelings to others. So often they communicate how they think and how they feel through their behaviour. And it is our responsibility as their carers, as their friends, as their family, as somebody who's trying to help, to interpret what their behaviour might mean for us. So behaviours that are commonly seen are things like withdrawal, physical aggression, in particular towards the self, but sometimes towards others, verbal aggression towards the self or others, crying, changes in eating or toileting. So, if their appetite might change, they might be overeating or undereating. Or toileting changes, somebody who was continent might become incontinent, or they might be experiencing diarrhoea or constipation. Loss or loss of interest in activities that were previously enjoyed, or refusal to engage in their usual routine. Physical grief responses that are pretty common include things like headaches, dry mouth, chest pain, and obviously if you experience chest pain, I know it says call 911 there, that's obviously an American image, but obviously if somebody's experiencing chest pain, please contact the doctor. Stomach pain, fairly common, fatigue, loss of appetite, nausea, shortness of breath, tightness in the stomach, throat or chest, being oversensitive to noise, having some muscle weakness, a lack of energy, confusion, sleep disturbance, hypertension, dizziness, shaking, sweating, pain, tingling, numbness, a previous illness flaring up, or hallucinations or dreaming, searching, crying. And that's often one that brings up a kind of a worry for people. So when you say the words hallucination or seeing things, but actually it's a fairly common grief response. So it's about the severity of it impacting on the person, or it's about how real it is to them. So often after somebody has died, you'll hear people say things like, I was down in the shops the other day and I could have sworn I saw my mum. I just could have sworn I saw her there. That's one version. Another version could be, the person talking to someone who isn't there beside them for hours and hours and hours, and when you ask who it is, they might say, oh, it's my mum. If the hallucinations or the dreaming or the searching are interfering with the person's everyday functioning, if it's getting in the way of their normal life, then that's something that we would always recommend a referral onwards to. So looking to refer to the GP or the mental health and intellectual disability team. So the impact of ID on grief in terms of the cognitive factors. So when a person has difficulties with learning or comprehending, it's common for people to assume that the person with the disability won't understand what has happened, or that they don't feel the loss or notice the loss. So as I said earlier, people often have the assumption that they need to be protected from the truth, that it might be too upsetting about them. So instead of talking about the issue, people just pretend it didn't happen because maybe they won't notice. But it's important to realise that people with disabilities don't need to have a full understanding or comprehension or concept of death to feel the loss of another person. They very well might just feel the loss by virtue of the fact that an important person in their life isn't there anymore. They're going to notice that. That's going to have an impact. And it might take a bit longer for them to notice, and you might see a delayed grief response because, for someone that they might have seen every week, it might take them several weeks to notice that that person hasn't been there. Or they might notice 20 minutes after they haven't shown up for their scheduled allotted time. But the idea that we can protect people with disabilities from grief and we can keep them from it is just not realistic. Loss and death are part of life. We all experience it, and therefore people with disabilities experience it too. And they deserve the opportunity to be part of the process of grieving for whatever that loss was. So I mentioned briefly earlier around the concepts of death. So when we talk about the concepts of death, we talk about 4 things that have a developmental trajectory to understand death. So universality, all living things die. Irreversibility, which I find hard to say, a dead body cannot become alive again. Non-functionality, a dead body doesn't function. It doesn't talk, it doesn't hear, it doesn't breathe, it's not hungry, it's not thirsty. And inevitability. Every living thing dies. We are all going to die. It is inevitable. So as people develop and as people mature and as we grow, this concept of death grows with us. So, when you think about children, young babies up to the age of kind of 5, they've no concept of death. They don't understand it at all. They might understand that somebody's gone and not coming back, but they don't really understand death. As we get older, we start to understand death a little bit more. So at the start, you start to understand universality. So you start to understand all living things die. So plants die, animals die, and people die. But you may not understand the other aspects. You mightn't understand that when somebody dies, they're gone forever, that they can't become alive again. Or you mightn't understand that a dead body can't feel. Or you mightn't understand that it is inevitable. But as you get older and as you mature at a developmental pace, you start to understand these other concepts. Many people with intellectual disabilities do not have a fully formed understanding of death and of its concepts. They might have some of the concepts and not others, or they might partially understand some of the concepts but not have a complete understanding of it. You don't need to have a complete understanding of death in order to grieve and feel a loss. But it is important to mention that by not having an understanding of these concepts, it might make things more difficult during a bereavement or loss. I'll give you a couple of examples here. So, for example, irreversibility. If I don't have a full understanding that a dead body cannot become alive again, I might think that somebody will become undead or might become a zombie or a vampire. And this is something that I have come across with people with intellectual disabilities, in particular people who are interested in like sci-fi horror TV shows. So they might know what a zombie is and they might know what a vampire is, and they may not know that those things are not real and that actually dead bodies can't become alive again. So they may not have a fully formed understanding of irreversibility. So it might be important for us to explain that once we realise that that's occurring. So it is important to sit down and tell somebody that dead bodies cannot become alive again if they are talking about things like that. Or another example in terms of non-functionality. A dead body doesn't function. I had a client before whose grandmother died and they became really, really, really upset. We couldn't figure out what was going on, but we knew that there was something particular bothering them. And eventually he said the phrase, "What if Nana's cold in the grave?" So the concept that she cannot feel cold, that the body and, let's say for virtue of another word, the soul are separated. So the body gets buried or cremated, it's in the ground, it cannot feel, it's not hungry, thirsty, cold, it cannot become alive again, but the soul, the essence of the person has, I don't know, it depends on your cultural belief, your religious belief, your personal belief, let's say gone to heaven, been reincarnated, joined the universe, whatever your belief is, that those two things are separate can be really difficult for somebody with an intellectual disability to really comprehend and understand, because actually for most of us it's hard to get our head around it. So it's really important to make sure that the person with intellectual disabilities understands that people's dead bodies don't feel any pain, that they cannot become alive again, and that it's a normal part of the life cycle. And concept of death varies depending on the person's developmental level, but also their lived experience. So if somebody's had a lot of deaths where these things have been explained several times to them, they may have more of an understanding than somebody who might be experiencing their first significant death. So how much you tell the person will be dependent on their life experiences. So this is just a little graphic that explains the developmental level of concept of death. So when you're looking at the bottom part, the person can sense loss and suffer the feelings associated with loss. They might have difficulty comprehending death, but they feel the loss. And as they move up the developmental trajectory, they might view death as being a temporary condition. So, okay, they're dead, but they'll come back again. They'll be back again in a couple of weeks or in a couple of months. The next step up, the person knows that death is inevitable, but might see death as alternating. Life and death as alternating, So you can be alive and dead and alive and dead. Or the person begins to realise that it's irreversible. And then the next level would be that they think more abstractly about life and death. So you can see that it's quite complex in terms of a full understanding of concept of death. So what impact does intellectual disability have on grief? So the first important thing is to mention communication factors. So some people with disabilities have complex communication needs. Not all people with disabilities, but many of them. They may be unable to use speech to meet their daily communication needs. They might rely to varying degrees on augmentative communication methods like vocalizations or gestures or facial expressions, or they might rely on alternative communication systems. So they may have, high-tech or low-tech communication systems to express their emotions, ask questions, or convey information about grief and loss. Some people may show difficulty expressing negative emotions because over time they've developed an attitude of trying to please others. So they may not feel they have the right or the permission to express negative emotions. Now for many of you, you might be thinking, that's ridiculous. People obviously know that they can be sad if they need to be sad. But for many people with intellectual disabilities, in particular people in Ireland, when you're talking about our adult population, so we're not talking about the young people, we're talking about our older population, they have experienced a very different life, where in order to survive and in order to be cared for, they have had to learn to be agreeable, to be likeable, because the more likeable they were, the more likely their needs were going to be met. So you might be talking about people who are taken into residential care at a very young age, people who left their family home, who don't have the experience of a loving, supportive family who will take them in all of their moods or all of their different feelings and accept them as they are. You might have somebody who was raised by staff who may not have been so kind or may not have been so accepting of some of their emotional states. So many people learn to acquiesce. They learn to do the thing that makes them likeable. And for those people, they find it particularly difficult to express what they consider to be negative emotions. For some people with disabilities, a change in behaviour might be the best indicator of grief and loss. So looking at those behavioural things, the withdrawal, the upset, the anger, the frustration, that might tell us more about how they're feeling than their words. So when you're looking at the learning experiences of someone with an intellectual disability on the grief process, things to take into consideration are things like the life experiences of people with disabilities. So that can make it difficult for them to deal effectively with loss and grief. So parents and many staff might treat them differently. For example, parents and staff at times might try to shield them from the harsh realities of life with the fear that they mightn't be able to cope with it. So many people with intellectual disabilities haven't had the same exposure to everyday losses and everyday experiences than people without intellectual disabilities. So, when children experience losses, it is important to expose them to it little by little. So the loss of a plant, the loss of an animal, the loss of, a favourite toy, whatever it is, experiencing those losses is a part of life, and many people with intellectual disabilities are shielded from that. People with disabilities might also have experienced multiple losses over time, so they might be the opposite. Rather than being protected, they might have experienced a range of losses. They might have seen a number of friends or people they know die. They might have experienced ongoing staff turnover, changes in residential settings and living arrangements, many of which are beyond their control. So they might be the opposite. They might have experienced loads of losses. and therefore learned to focus on their own needs. And as long as their own needs are being met, may not be as overtly impacted by those losses. If the person has a limited number of close relationships and social supports, the impact of those losses might be more magnified than would otherwise be the case. I spoke a bit about that previously. So what can complicate the grief? And when we talk about complicated grief, we are talking about a very specific thing. So complicated grief is a difficulty processing grief, a difficulty adjusting to life after loss. Things that can complicate the grief are things like an increased risk of secondary loss. So if the person who has died is the primary caregiver, that loss can be experienced at several levels. So as a result of the person's death, the person with the disability may not only experience the loss of someone they care very much about, but they may also experience major changes in their daily routine. So living arrangements. So if it's a parent and they're living at home with them and the parent dies, they may have to move out. The house might have to be sold. Their financial circumstances might have changed. So if a parent was meeting their financial needs and now all of a sudden they're not, and they're living on maybe just their disability allowance, they may not be as flush with cash as they once were. Or their routine. So if every Monday me and Mum had coffee in our local coffee shop, and every Tuesday we went to the shop or the butcher's to do this, and every Wednesday we did something else, it's not just the loss of the person, it's also the loss of the life that was with that person. So it can be far more magnified. Barriers communicating about the loss, so difficulties in expressing how they feel about a loss. Difficulty finding meaning in loss. So for many of us, we turn to spirituality to help support us find meaning in loss. For many people with intellectual disabilities, spirituality can be really abstract and really difficult to get their head around. They may have a delayed grief reaction, and it's one of the things in the research that is showing is that many times people with intellectual disabilities can experience a delayed grief reaction, and it can be up to a year before they truly feel the impact of that loss. And the other thing just to be cautious over is diagnostic overshadowing, so pathologizing grief. It is normal for somebody to be extremely sad in the weeks and months following a loss. That doesn't mean that someone is experiencing depression. They're grieving. So it's important not to over-pathologize the grief, but it's important not to miss it on the other side either. So if somebody has had a delayed grief reaction and they coped quite well in the immediate aftermath of a loss, but 12 months later the person is crying a lot, getting very upset, maybe withdrawing, it's important not to jump straight to, oh well, it can't be anything related to that loss, sure that was a year ago, it must be something else. It's important to consider it as something that might be coming up for the person in the time following a loss. So moving on from concepts of death and more towards theories of grief, and I'm not going to spend too long with this because I don't know how practical it is for most of you, but there are lots of theories of grief. I picked out the three that are most commonly discussed and kind of understood. So the stages of loss or grief, most of you have probably heard of before, originally developed by Kubler-Ross, but since have been worked on by others. So most of you have probably heard about the 5 or the 7 stages of loss or grief. So the 7 stages are shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, testing and acceptance. So Kubler-Ross added the extra 2 steps as an extension of the original grief cycle, just because the original grief cycle didn't seem to capture everything. So these are commonly experienced stages of grief. It's important to mention that they don't happen sequentially. So you don't start with one and move to the next and move to the next and move to the next, and then you come to the end acceptance and that's it, you're done, your grief experience is over. That it is a cycle, and that you can go from one to back to another and then forward to another and then back to another, and you might skip one and go skip 2 and then go back to the start again, and that it isn't a straightforward trajectory. It's a bit kind of all over the place, and that's normal. And acceptance of the loss isn't a goal that you're trying to reach. It's not, well, I'm going to hit acceptance and then I'm going to be fine. You might very well get to acceptance and then go back to denial and that that's okay, that it is stages of grief, and that you don't spend, most people don't spend all of their time in one stage, that you go through the stages. The next theory of grief or model of grief is the continuing bonds model, originally developed by Klass. So this looks primarily at the crux of it is that the relationship with the person who has died doesn't end when they die, but it changes. So the model explores the presence of an ongoing inner relationship with the person who has died. So if, let's say, a parent dies, my relationship with the parent doesn't end, but it no longer exists with the person alive right now. So it changes. My relationship continues on with their memory. And continuing bonds models looks for ways of continuing that bond with that person. So ways of keeping that person with you to continue that bond. So whether that's through keeping photographs of the person, whether it's through keeping items that they belonged, it might be about visiting the grave, it might be about just simply keeping them in your thoughts for different things. That bond continues to grow with the person. And then finally, the dual process model developed by Warden. This theory describes two different ways of behaving associated with grief. So a loss-orientated and a restoration-orientated focus. So when you are loss-orientated, you are focused on the loss. When you are restoration or forward-thinking focus, you are focused on the here and now or the future. So the idea is that you switch between these different modes of being when you're grieving, and that initially, immediately after the loss, you'll spend a lot of your time loss-orientated thinking, so focusing on the loss, on the person. But you'll have brief moments of restoration or future-focused thinking, and that the more distance you get from the loss, that the more time you spent on restoration-orientated focus. So that's essentially those three models in a nutshell. There's obviously a huge more amount of information in terms of theories of grief, and if you are interested, I would recommend that you continue to read up on them, and there are some references at the end that might be helpful. So how to support someone who's grieving then? So before I get into the generic advice, I will just briefly mention that supports offered do need to be individualised based on what the person needs. So remembering that each grief experience is a unique experience, everything has to be tailored to that person and their needs. But there are some general guidelines that might be helpful to help you come up with ideas that might be able to be individualised for that person. So, if a person is not told about the death openly and honestly, then the person's right to know has not been respected. The person is denied the opportunity to learn about life and death. The person is once again shielded from bad news. The person is denied an opportunity to be part of the normal grief activities like attending a funeral. And the person may perceive the loss but not in an accurate way. So they might comprehend the loss, but comprehend it as something different to what it actually is. And their interpretation might actually be much worse than the reality. So by seeing, let's say, somebody's body dressed in clothes they like with maybe their favourite jewellery before they're buried, that gives you, a sense of who they are. But if you don't see that, you might have a very different image in your head, and it might be a much more frightening image. So often the reality is better than somebody's perception of what's going on. So if somebody is ill, try and ensure that the person is informed of the illness. Offer an opportunity for the person to visit the person if at all possible, because it shows them in a real way that allows the person to interpret what's going on at a deeper level than just using words. Prepare them for what it might look like. So depending on the person's communication support needs, a social story, verbal information in the here and now, or pictures might be helpful. But when you're looking at whatever way you're going to communicate it, you're looking at what are the main messages I want to communicate. So what are they going to see? That their loved one is sick, that the doctors are looking after them, and that they can leave whenever they want. They're the most important messages. And how you communicate that to the person will depend on what level of support that person needs to understand it. If you can speak to the family about a plan following bereavement, so supporting the person to attend a funeral, if you can speak to them before the person dies. So if you know somebody's ill and maybe terminally ill, having an opportunity to speak to the family about what will likely happen, how you can support the person, what the family want, what the person might want, can help clarify things so that in the immediate aftermath of a death you don't have to have those tricky conversations. Preparation is key, so if possible, prepare around what will happen during the funeral. Family and friends being present is usually really helpful after somebody has died, so most of us want to be with our family and friends when we've experienced a loss. Seeing the person's body is usually helpful unless the person has a particular preoccupation with dead bodies or may have hallucinations associated with them. Attending the funeral is usually helpful unless the person again is really averse to the idea. Don't rush the process. Normal grief lasts for months. We don't expect somebody to lose someone and within a week or two recover. Avoid changes to staff. Avoid changes to residents in the immediate aftermath or changes to day service. And try and give the person time to adjust to life without the person without having any other additional changes. Provide accurate information in an accessible way. So look at their communication matrix. How do they communicate? How are they best supported with their communication needs? And what changes or what adaptations can we make to help support their communication? And then look at the losses that the person has experienced and help the person make sense of what their life looks like without the deceased. So if, let's say, the person used to go to the cinema with the person who has died every Thursday, offering the choice for that person to continue to go to the cinema every Thursday, even though the person won't be with them. Is that a routine that they still want to continue? So what helps if you can't attend someone's funeral? And I suppose this is particularly relevant during the recent COVID-19 pandemic, where people weren't able to attend the funerals of loved ones. But there might be lots of reasons that somebody can't attend somebody's funeral. They might be far away, there might be physical barriers to their being able to attend, or they may not want to go to the funeral, but they might want to do some of these things. So for whatever reason somebody can't attend a funeral, consider doing some of the following. So you could try video call into the funeral home or video call into the church or crematorium, wherever the service is being held. You might have a memorial service for the person at home, so you might use pictures, candles, readings. It might only be a 5-minute thing where the people in the person's home have a couple of minutes to have a memorial service for the person who has died. You might support the person to create a memory box of the person who has died, and that box can have things like photographs or objects that they've given or reminders of the person in it. You might do a life storybook with the person where they have photographs of their life, including the person who has died. You might create a memory garden where you plant a flower for the person who has died and that you care for the flower or plant. You might assist the person to write a letter to the person who has died. It doesn't need to be sent anywhere, but the process of writing the letter can be therapeutic. Or you might choose to visit the grave or a place that reminds them of the person, like their family home or a favourite holiday spot or a favourite restaurant that they used to go to together. And this is just a couple of ideas. There might be other ideas that you come up with that are more appropriate to that specific person and how they'll cope. So when we're talking about breaking the news that somebody has died, decide with the family who will break the news. Usually we recommend a familiar staff member and a family member to break the news, if it's a family death in particular. And usually having 2 people there can be helpful. But it is important to decide amongst yourself. It's not always possible to do that, and it's not always helpful to have both. So just looking at who is the most appropriate person to break the news. And the most appropriate person is somebody who the person feels comfortable and safe with. Go to a quiet, calm area where there are no distractions. There isn't a radio on or a telly on or people playing a game of pool nearby. Quiet, calm area. Check that the person is feeling calm. Explain the death using practical supports like pictures, social stories, or verbally. And what I would say there is often helpful to start with a phrase like, I have some bad news, or I have some sad news. Because by using a phrase like that, you're drawing somebody's attention to what you're about to say next. Only use concrete language. So there are some sample scripts that have been developed for the different communication types, but concrete language, when we say that, is we want you to use the phrase X has died or X is dead. Don't use phrases like has passed away or is no longer with us, because they're very abstract and they don't really mean anything. What does passed away mean to somebody? So only use concrete language. Repeat at least 3 times during the conversation. And we don't mean saying, let's say for example, John has died. Did you hear me now? John has died. We don't mean that kind of repetition. But throughout the conversation, you might start by saying something like, I have some bad news. Your dad has died. This means that his body is no longer breathing or living. And then depending on the person's cultural background will depend on how you describe the rest of it. Some people might want you to say things like their soul has gone to heaven. And actually, interestingly, in disability research, you would think that being very abstract wouldn't mean a lot to people with disabilities. But interestingly, I don't know if it's just because we're a very Catholic country here in Ireland, but often that is a phrase that can be comforting for people, and it is often how they understand death. So, knowing the person's spiritual and cultural preferences will help you phrase the next part. But repeating at some point that it's very sad that your dad has died might be another way of putting it, or you might be feeling sad because your dad has died. So you can repeat it without it feeling harsh. But it is important to repeat it, because if they haven't quite picked it up the first time, they might the second or third. Explain what will happen next, if you know. So you might say something like, there will be a funeral tomorrow. You might explain what a funeral means. A funeral means that your dad's dead body will be in a box called a coffin. The coffin will be in a church. Lots of people will come to the church to say goodbye to Dad. A priest will say a mass. Then we will go to the graveyard where the coffin will be put in the ground. Then we will go have soup and sandwiches in the house. Knowing what the process the following day is will obviously impact how you're going to explain what will happen next. Expect silences. Leave space for distress. Of course there is going to be distress. Bring tissues. And just a little side note around safety, please don't offer food or drink until after the news has been discussed and the person is calm. And that's just to reduce the risk of them aspirating or choking on whatever they're given. Because when we're upset, we find it harder to control our breathing. So you want to make sure that the person is a bit calmer before you offer the cup of tea. Please check the person's communication matrix and their PCSP before you explain the information. Look at what types of support they need. But in general, use short sentences. Minimise the use of conjunctions, so the ands, buts, all those, however's, excepts. So having a sentence that has a finish point is helpful. Think about what you were going to say before you say it, and think about how you were going to say it. The structure of your sentence is very important. You need to keep your message clear and focused. As I said earlier, a sentence like, your dad has died, is much better than, I'm so sorry to tell you now, and you know the way your dad was sick in hospital, but he didn't get better, and actually, I'm really sorry to say it, but unfortunately your dad has passed away. You see the difference in clarity between those two messages. Speak in a calm, clear tone of voice. Don't rush. Allow time for the person to listen, to process what you are saying, and to respond. Allow silence and allow for gaps. You don't need to fill them. Be mindful of additional supports that the person might need to understand your message, like having a picture of the person who's died, using love signs, having gestural prompts or pictorial prompts. And when needed, repeat your message. So you might choose to do this by adding in more context, like I have sad news, Mary died, Mary was very sick, the doctors tried their best to help Mary, Mary died in hospital, Mary is dead, her funeral is on tomorrow. So in terms of expressive supports, a person might communicate their grief verbally, physically or emotionally. Others might find it difficult to express their grief through typical modalities of communication and might benefit from additional outlets like art, music, looking at photographs, creating life books. And it's normal for the person to speak frequently about a loved one who has died. If a person asks where they are, it's important that you use a phrase that is understandable to the person. Like, where is Dad? And the response might be, Dad died, Dad is in heaven, I know you miss Dad. So just an important note, just again as we're finishing up, do not use abstract language like lost, gone away, passed on, with God. Separate what happens to the body and what happens to the soul. The person's body cannot hear, see, feel, etc., but their soul has gone to heaven and they are okay, they are safe. Reassure the person that they are safe. Do not lie or give mixed messages. If you don't know something, it's okay to say that you don't know. So if somebody says, what happens after we die? You don't have to say that you know the answer to that. You can say, I don't know. Nobody knows for sure. But people who are Catholic believe that when somebody dies, they go to heaven and that heaven is a nice place where people are safe. Other people believe something else. And it's okay to say that. It's okay to say that you're not sure of something. And just remember the simple message. Be kind, but don't sugarcoat the message. You can be kind and compassionate without making the message so sweet that the meaning gets lost. Some helpful resources. This booklet called Let's Talk About Death is a really, really good booklet developed by Down Syndrome Scotland. It's available on the CT Library and it's also available online. And it's a particularly good book that talks you through explaining death to someone and talks about some of those trickier concepts in terms of explaining concept of death, like the process of a funeral or like the fact that a dead body can't come alive again. It's really good. There's some additional resources there that are helpful. Thank you so much for listening to the presentation. If you have any questions or you want to follow up in more detail about somebody who has experienced their loss or bereavement, please contact the Adult MDT team through the referral process, or you can contact myself at my email address or by using my mobile number. Thanks so much for listening.